Okay, let's jump right into this explainer with a pretty surprising story about a guy you definitely know, Isaac Newton. Now, most of us picture him sitting under a tree with an apple, figuring out the laws of motion. But his role in the history of money, it's just as fascinating, and it perfectly sets the stage for our entire journey today.
Picture this. It's 1696. England hands its national currency over to the greatest living scientist, probably expecting him to take a nice, quiet desk job, right? Well, instead, Newton takes over the Royal Mint and basically treats the gig like a massive, high-stakes manhunt. He is out there, actively hunting down criminals in London taverns and prisons. These were people who were clipping the edges off silver coins, just shaving off tiny little slivers of metal until the money in your pocket bore almost zero relation to its actual face value. He actually solved this by giving coins milled edges. You know, those fine little ridges you can still feel on the edges of modern coins today? That was Newton, making sure any tampering would immediately announce itself.
But here is where it gets wild. In 1717, Newton makes a technical pricing error, and it accidentally launches the rising British Empire onto the gold standard. He set the official ratio between gold and silver, but he priced silver just a tiny bit too cheap. And because of that one little miscalculation, silver quickly drained out of the country, gold flowed in, and the guy who discovered gravity had, almost as a side project, completely by accident, set the trajectory of global money for the next 200 years. It's just a perfect example of how the monetary history of gold is really this grand story of trust, how it's engineered, how it's defended, and yeah, how it's occasionally stumbled into.
Which brings us to our first main topic, from scales to stamped coins, the origins of money. Now, to really understand gold's true power, we actually have to look way back to places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, long before Newton was around. Back then, transactions were based entirely on physical weight, not a ruler's stamp. And this illustrates a huge, absolutely crucial shift in human history. In those early weight-based systems, money wasn't just a token, it was a physical substance. Relying on an actual physical scale imposed absolute discipline. I mean, there was simply no magic mechanism for expanding the money supply without physically going out and acquiring more metal. Trade imbalances had very real, very immediate consequences. But as societies grew more complex, coinage was introduced. And sure, stamped coins were great because they reduced transaction costs and made trade a whole lot easier, but they also handed rulers a wildly dangerous temptation to manipulate value. Once value was tied to a stamp rather than just the raw metal content, well, the door to political abuse was thrown wide open.
We can trace this build-up over time. It starts with the very first widely recognized coins in Lydia, way back in the 7th century BCE. The idea spread like wildfire, but eventually it leads to Rome's massive monetary decay. See, Rome relied on a bimetallic system, and for a long time, the aureus, their gold coin, was incredibly stable. But as the empire kept expanding, military costs soared, and they just couldn't collect enough taxes to cover it. So what did they do? They debased the currency. Trust was broken, and honestly, it wasn't until way later with the Florentine florin in the 13th century CE that international monetary trust was finally restored.
And that leads us perfectly into Section 2, the endless cycle of debasement, how rulers broke trust.
The really crucial point here is that once money became just a stamped coin, rulers throughout history literally could not resist the temptation to cheat to fund their ambitions. You can see this tragic pattern repeat over and over in these 5 inevitable steps. Step 1, the initial coins have super high purity. Step 2, people trust the coin and its circulation expands. Step 3, the ruler faces immense fiscal pressure, usually, to fund a war or expand their territory. Step 4, they debase the currency. They literally reduce the precious metal content while forcing people to accept it at the exact same face value. And finally, step 5, rampant inflation, confidence totally erodes, and the system collapses. This exact cycle famously destroyed Rome's economy. They shaved silver and gold off their coins to fund their expanding empire, which ultimately led to massive social unrest, economic fragmentation, and in some regions, a full regression back to bartering. The key takeaway here, gold didn't fail, the governance did. So after centuries of this exact cycle repeating, trust was finally restored through the strict purity of coins like the Florentine florin in medieval Europe and the Islamic dinar. These coins succeeded for a very specific reason. They maintained consistent weight and purity. They proved that gold thrives when it isn't monopolized by a single power. You see, competition among medieval states acted as a built-in check on debasement because suddenly reputation actually mattered. If the state tried to debase its coinage, international merchants would simply discount it or flat out reject it.
All right, moving into Section 3, the classical gold standard, 1870 to 1914.
This era was really the 19th century peak. This is when the world locked itself into strict international rules with the classical gold standard. But it is vital for us to understand that the system was a massive, and I mean massive, bargain. On one hand, the system delivered absolute miracles. We're talking long-term price stability, an unprecedented flowering of global trade, and heavily restrained government deficits. But it demanded a brutal trade-off. It essentially forced everyday workers to absorb all the painful economic shocks. If a country ran a trade deficit, gold flowed out, the domestic money supply contracted, credit tightened, and prices and wages plummeted. Without the option of modern monetary expansion, these adjustments were swift and they were incredibly harsh. Insolvent institutions simply failed outright, and there were absolutely zero social safety nets. The system prioritized price stability above all else, even if it meant sacrificing full employment.
Which brings us to Section 4. Why the system broke. The end of constraint.
Eventually, that harsh discipline just became completely intolerable for modern politically complex societies. The real breaking point? The First World War. When WWI required practically limitless spending, governments had no choice but to suspend convertibility to finance those unprecedented military costs. And once the war ended, they couldn't just put the genie back in the bottle. The rise of mass democracy drastically shifted public expectations. Labor organized into unions, and the working class absolutely refused to accept the brutal wage deflation that the gold standard required to actually function. Finally, the Great Depression sealed gold's fate. Democratic governments were under immense pressure to prioritize employment and economic growth. The rigid, unforgiving constraints of gold were finally abandoned simply because the massive deflation it demanded was now completely politically toxic.
There's a perfect summary for this transition. Gold constrained power, fiat empowers it. Ultimately, gold wasn't abandoned because it somehow failed as a tool for commerce. Not at all. It was abandoned because the strict physical limits it placed on political power became way too frustrating for governments to bear. Gold constrained power by strictly limiting deficit financing and drastically reducing the scope for discretionary monetary policy. Fiat money, on the other hand, empowers governments. It allows them to expand the money supply to stabilize financial systems, finance deficits, and respond dynamically to economic shocks. By the way, this video was inspired by the book Gold, a story about money, wealth, and the architecture of value. Link in description. It's a fantastic deep dive into exactly how these monetary systems evolved over time, and I highly, highly recommend checking it out if you want to learn more.
Which leaves us with one massive, lingering question for our modern fiat system to answer. If gold was abandoned precisely because it physically constrained political power, what exactly constrains that power today? It's a huge question, and history suggests every generation eventually has to answer it for itself. Thank you so much for learning with me today, and keep asking the big questions.